Good morning, Ram. I hope you are well. Welcome to Lawful Non-Lawyers, an introduction to common law. Part 3, the law of torts. Now, torts are a civil right of action arising independently of contract, restitution, crime, or equity. Torts serve to protect a person's interest in his or her bodily security, tangible property, whether that's real or chattels, financial resources, or reputation. Unlawful interference with one of these interests is redressable by an action for damages, and potential interference may be prevented by an injunction. The law of torts aims to restore the injured person to the position they would have been had the harm or the tort or the wrong not occurred. Torts are wonderful. They're at large, these rights of action. And I think what we want to really understand is that they protect underlying interests in rights. Underlying interests, whether they be in bodily integrity, and we will look at 3 different torts now concerning assault, battery, and a trespass. Assault, battery, and a false imprisonment. And all 3 of those torts are under the heading of trespass to the person. And these 3 torts try and protect the rights we all have inherently in our human form. So they look after our bodily integrity. With the tort of assault, we're looking after the right not to be threatened with violence. In the tort of battery, we look at the right not to be touched without consent. And we look at the tort of false imprisonment, which is protecting your underlying right of freedom of movement. So torts are beautiful because each of our underlying right draws a remedy. So torts, think it's an ancient French word for twisted. Think contortionist, tort, and you've got it. It's a wrong, and the law attempts to provide a right, a remedy for that wrong, to undo it. And the whole goal is to put you back in the position you would have been had the harm not occurred. That's compensatory damages. So we're trying to right the wrong of the underlying right or interest that's protected. So I've just talked about the 3 trespass to the person torts, and we'll go into those in a bit of detail. But there are also torts that then come to the rescue or the aid of other underlying rights. So think about land or your interest in or over land. It could be possession. It could be the right to exclusive possession. It could be a lease. It could protect your use and enjoyment of the land with the tort of nuisance. So we have trespass to the person, but we also have trespass to land, where your rights in land has been trespassed on. And the torts pertaining to land, nuisance and trespass are the 2 that will provide a remedy for infringement of rights over land. Likewise, there's trespass to goods, where your rights in or over goods, whether that's possession or ownership, have been trampled on. So we'd have trespass to goods, and we also have conversion to goods, another tort, where you've altered or converted the title or the goods in a manner repugnant to the rights of the owner, and that would be to convert the goods. And that attracts a right that you can sue to redress the wrong, the tort over your goods. Also, we can use torts to protect another underlying right, and that's our reputation, and that's the tort of defamation. Used to be libel and slander. Slander was spoken and libel was written. But many modern jurisdictions have abolished that nuanced difference and just settled on a tort of defamation regardless of how the defamatory material was communicated to the public, whether it's or published. Whether it was written or spoken is irrelevant in modern society. Okay, so what I'd like us to understand today is the difference between a tort and, say, criminal law, where you have the state and a set of rules, and it's the state enforcing those rules against the alleged or accused offender, someone who's offended those rules. So that's a public law jurisdiction where the state and individuals are the litigants or the people in dispute. Whereas torts is a private law area. So we talked about contract law, that's private law between individual and individual, bearing in mind that obviously can involve a corporation or even a government, so any legal entity. So we're in the private law domain of torts, and as I say, we are trying to protect, or torts does protect, those underlying rights or interests in things, whether that's our body or land or goods or even reputation. So it's a wonderful thing. It's at large in that you owe duties and you'd be liable in torts to people you've never even met. Very different to contract law, where, as we've learned, there needs to be an intention of the parties to create a legally binding agreement, and then the courts will go ahead and try and enforce, wherever possible, the facets of that agreement that can carry on and or award damages for a breach of that contract or that agreement. Not so with torts. So we have trespass to the person, trespass to land, trespass to goods, negligent law is another area that negligence is wonderful. Negligence tries to create relations between people who don't have a relationship, don't have a contract. And negligence law is the youngest of all the torts. These evolved out of the common law torts. Negligence is the youngest of all the torts, but it's by far the king of the torts. It's like a genie that was escaped out the bottle and it's been very hard to put back in the bottle. Jurisdictions again have tried to curtail this common law action with statutory interventions, putting limitations on common law rights in the tort of negligence because of a litigation culture and perhaps an insurance crisis with premiums going up. In Australia, they had the IP report in 2001, and that triggered a range of statutory interventions at state level to curtail common law rights under the tort of negligence because people were worried about insurance crisis and litigation crisis clogging the courts. So negligence is another tort that protects us all against a failure of reasonable care, and we'll get to that as well. And negligence is wonderful because it raises standard of behaviour. It raises conduct. I used to teach negligence law to young doctors, and initially they were reluctant to talk to a lawyer about negligence law, to learn it, and they felt lawyers were the bane of doctors' lives. But by the end of the course, they realised that lawyers were very helpful. And without standards put in place, without reasonable, objective tests, then it would be a race to the bottom, even in that industry. And it would all become about money. And, they thought that they worked long hours now. Imagine it if there was no negligence law. They'd be doing even more. So we need laws. We need the tort of negligence to keep everyone in check and to keep conduct elevated to a reasonable standard that protects people. It reduces harm. Some people, so a famous American judge, Posner, has posited that the whole of the area of torts law can be looked at as an economic model to shift loss, to prevent loss landing where it falls. If I put out your eye and you lose an eye or two eyes, if there wasn't a tort system to redress that, then the loss would lie with you. You'd have limitations on income, you may need care, that would all lie on you and or the state if you could claim compensation or support, probably support and help from your state. So to shift that loss onto the tortfeasor, or the person who committed the wrong, is an economic goal of the law of torts. It's not fair that the loss lies where it falls, that you've lost your eyes and then the economic consequences of that if someone was in the wrong and that's why you've lost your eye. So isn't it better to get compensation off the tortfeasor, the wrongdoer, to try and redress your situation rather than have you just suck it up because that was bad luck and or you become a burden on the state and seek ongoing support. So that's a good example because that also shows us the limitations of the tort and tort remedies of damages and compensatory damages, because obviously there is no compensation amount that would put you in a position you would have been had the harm not occurred. You can't buy back your eyes. No amount of money can give you your sight back, current medical knowledge. However, so there's a shortfall. However, what the law of torts tries to do is the next best thing will try and compensate you for a missing limb or damage in a monetary sum that at least can go towards care and rehabilitation and or economic support in lieu of the damage that you have suffered and the loss you've suffered. So it can't quite give you back an eye or a leg, but in the world of economic torts, it can fully compensate you for your economic loss, like for like. You lose $1 million on negligent statement or advice, you can sue for the $1 million. That does put you back in the position you would have been. So, torts is wonderful. Torts is, I always think of it like a jellyfish in that it's at large. It touches all of us. You get on your bicycle or in a car and you drive on the road, you owe a duty to take reasonable care under the tort of negligence to everybody, even people you haven't met. There is a duty to take reasonable care. Now contrast that with the law of contract, where you have to have an agreement with someone. Otherwise, you're not privy to that contract. You can't sue under the contract or be sued. You're not party. You're not involved. The criminal law, likewise, we're all bound by the rules of the Crimes Act and other criminal legislation and common law, but it would be the state to take action against us, not so in torts. So let's have a think about and let's explain and understand trespass to the person. It's a good place to start. And with that understanding, we can then build on that with the other torts. The first trespass to the person we'll talk about, and these are ancient, these are almost the birthplace of our civil liberties as citizens. Think back to the Magna Carta, think to the king's men kicking the peasants in the paddocks and the fields. When we give people rights, they have a right not to be kicked or abused. And one of the oldest torts is the tort of battery. So battery is the unlawful touching of another without consent. So that would be a definition. So it could be any touching without consent. It doesn't have to be painful or harmful or injurious. It can just be touching without consent. So battery is useful in medical situations whereby the treating doctor has gone beyond their remit. Classic cases of a patient having a hysterectomy or a minor procedure, and while the doctor's in there, he notices cancer, so he gives her a hysterectomy for her benefit. Well, it doesn't matter. That's still a battery because that's touching of the body without consent. You need consent to give someone a hysterectomy. There would be limits on that, or defences. If it was necessary to save life, there might be a defence, but best practice would be to wake them back up, tell them of the issue, get consent and go back in. If it's not immediate and life-threatening, that would be what you need to do to avoid a lawsuit in battery. So there are obviously lots of rules around this. The merest touching without consent can be a battery. Obviously, a punch on the nose would be a battery. It doesn't have to be, it needs to be direct contact is really important. But it can be throwing a stone at somebody or spitting at someone, or a gas or light shined in someone's eyes could be a battery. So any unlawful contact with the body, because what you think you're trying to do is you're trying to protect the underlying right. Okay, so zoom out and think about that. What is your underlying right? Well, it's about your bodily integrity. All right, so anything that infringes your right to have autonomy over your own individual body is potentially a battery. Now, it's an interesting tort because you don't even have to know you've been battered for the tort to come alive or to be actionable. If you fell asleep on a park bench and someone came and kissed you on the head, that would be a battery. You don't even know you're battered, but you have been battered, technically. So, there are defences, obviously. Consent is a perfect defence. That can be verbal. The doctor can say, I want to put this in your ear, and you can say, yeah, sure. But it can be implied as well. If you cocked your head and nodded, then you've given consent for doctor to put that in your ear. But if you then said, get it out, from that moment, if the doctor's got a reasonable time to respond, but if they don't, that's a battery. If they say, no, it's all right, I'm keeping it in there, you say, no, take it out, and they refuse, that's a battery. All right? So that means it's about the consent when it's been communicated, clear and unambiguous, reasonable period to respond. If that wasn't adhered to, then the tort would come alive. There are other defences, the exigencies of daily life. So if you get on a busy bus and someone's bumping, or we're all bumping each other on a train because we're stood up, then technically that's a battery, but there is a defence of reasonable, what we all reasonably consent to for everyday life. However, if someone put their hand on your leg, that wouldn't be everyday conduct, would it? That would be quite unpleasant, and that would be a battery. So there's boundaries around what's acceptable. Pushing up on someone getting on a tube, technically a battery, but you've got a defence of everyday conduct or contact. Whereas someone putting their hand on your thigh, no, not everyday conduct, that's a battery. So context is important. So battery is interesting. It protects our underlying right for bodily integrity. No touching without consent. You don't even have to know you've been battered. You can be unconscious in the operating theatre. That can be a battery. You can be asleep. But it's a beautiful talk because it does give us all bodily integrity, right? Or it gives legal protection to our bodily integrity. It gives legal authority for you to say, get off or don't touch me. And that's great. Because again, remember, what are we trying to do? We're trying to keep the peace. We're trying to stop vigilante drama and justice. We're trying to keep everything calm. And we're trying to keep the wheels of commerce turning to pay those taxes to fuel that economy. All right. Battery. Another trespass to the person is the tort of assault. This is where any direct act that, technically it's a voluntary direct act. All right. So even the battery, it needs to be a voluntary act to batter someone. If I sneeze and fall on you, then I might have battered you, but I've got a defence in that. It was an involuntary action. So it needs to be a voluntary and a positive direct act that then brings about this infringement on the underlying right. So let's get back to assault. It's a positive and a voluntary act that creates reasonable apprehension of imminent contact, i.e. a battery, right? So a raised fist. If you reasonably apprehended that you were going to be punched, a raised fist would be a battery, an assault, because it's infringing on your rights. And it's an interesting one because it's almost trying to protect mental tranquility. It's obviously to stop threats, highwaymen, your money or your life. It's an old tort, but it's useful still because it can protect our rights, as I say, of mental tranquility. So